Early September is possibly the best time of the year, when the scorching heat of July is no longer present, but in the evenings it's still pretty warm, and you can sit in your own office and think about various philosophical topics before going to bed. And it's especially true when you're almost 8 decades old and thoughts of the eternal are gripping you more and more often. How have you lived all this time? What have you come to, and what can you be proud of? These thoughts occupied his head. Our history knows many people who have become rich and famous, but only few of them can boast that they are also the founding fathers of an entire state or many states, which are called nowadays the United States of America. And one such man lived in the second half of the 18th century, and his name was none other than Benjamin Franklin. Most people know him today from his portrait on the $100 bill of the United States. Yes, this man has had the honor of being placed alongside the presidents of this country by his role in the politics, and not just politics, although he himself has never been a president. But by and large, he did not aspire to this, although he was active in political and public life of society at the time. So let's ask, what did he want in this case? The best way by far is to ask him, and we know his answers. So what are them? All you gotta do is travel to Philadelphia in the mid-1780s. Benjamin Franklin, the great man and one of the founding fathers of a very influential nation today, and pretty powerful and resistant back then, USA. This man will be discussed today in Wealth History, and welcome to the channel. Don't waste your time. It's an important step on your way to power and money. The old, though still young by spirit man, sitting in a well-preserved leather chair near the window had answers to many questions, and he was now writing them down on paper to leave his thoughts for posterity. It's time to tell you about these writings. Exactly 3 years ago, he, along with John Adams and John Jay, signed a treaty with Great Britain in Paris, according to which it recognized the independence of 13 of its former North American colonies. Yes, the original 13 colonies. Franklin called to mind with pleasure the bitter expressions on the faces of the members of the British delegation in Paris, who then refused to pose for the artist for a group portrait. Well, it's worse for them in any way. There's only one American delegation left to represent the winning side. Yes, very few people can boast of involvement in the founding of an entire country, and this is already a reason to think that life was well lived. But when at the beginning of the 18th century, the 15th child was born in the family of a poor immigrant from Britain, Josiah Franklin, hardly anyone could have imagined how far this kid would go. Even more so, Benjamin could not get a proper education. His father simply did not have the means to pay for it. However, he took a different path. At the age of 12, he got a job in a printing house and began to educate himself nevertheless. Thus, the future founding father demonstrated his attitude to labor and education and desire not to waste his free time from childhood, and at the same time great budgeting, because a simple printing worker simply didn't have extra money. And by the way, his vegetarianism helped him save a lot of money. As a teenager, he gave up meat. In general, young Benjamin abstained from excesses, didn't smoke or drink alcohol, which at the time was truly popular here and there. Moderation in his needs remained with him for the rest of his life. Even when his business went up, he became the owner of a printing house himself, and his income increased accordingly. Time is money. Talk less and do more. Meanwhile, he realized the importance of social activities and became closely involved in them. He began to publish a newspaper, founded a discussion circle for his friends and acquaintances, and then even a public library. Thinking back to those days, Franklin shook his head in false denial. And how could he manage to do it all, even though he barely slept more than 5 hours a night? Maybe, just maybe, it's because it was at that time that he made it a rule to talk less and do more. And besides, he avoided useless work in every possible way. That is, if something didn't satisfy him or brought good results, Benjamin Franklin refused to do it. What's the point of continuing in such a case, since it's a waste of time no matter what? And time is money. Yes, he formulated his thesis personally and strictly observed, no matter what. Perhaps that's why he managed to do as much as there will be a lot for several other people. Franklin worked all his life, and even now, at such an advanced age, he was keenly interested in the news of science, politics, and social life, exactly as he used to during his youth. He was never afraid to make mistakes. They gave him flexibility of thinking and the ability to quickly navigate circumstances based on changed commitments. In many ways, this allowed him to succeed in his life. It is not surprising that the active and intelligent young man was noticed by the Freemasons from the Lodge of St. John, and after a while invited Benjamin to their place. He did not hesitate for a second and agreed. Among the Freemasons, he was considered one of their own, and in a few years he became the Grand Master of the lodge. Franklin swinged his head when he thought about it deeper. There was so much gossiping and outright nonsense about brotherhood, but he shouldn't pay attention to it. Do your job and be prepared for failure, and then the success will come sooner or later. Be ready for failures. They are inevitable. The hard work did pay off. By the age of 30, Franklin was elected to the Pennsylvania Chamber. He soon became the postmaster of this colony, while continuing to run the printing press and publish a newspaper. True though, he now entrusted this task more to his most intelligent employees, so that he had more time for other activities, including political ones. He scheduled his day clearly, structuring his to-dos and focusing on what he considered most important. Let all things lie in their proper place. Let everything have its time, Benjamin wrote in his diary. A little bit later, he added the following quote: "Many people die at the age of 25, and they go to the grave only at 75. This is what happens when they lose interest to life around them, stop doing what gave them confidence and educated them, and go with the flow without trying to find something of their own." In his long life, Franklin saw many such people who were lost in time, and no one had ever heard of them. It's like they never existed. Well, they chose their own destiny. Yes, as a man brought up in a Protestant family, he was sincerely convinced that everyone is responsible for his own life before himself and obviously God. Despite that, Benjamin himself never had fanatic-like approach. He preferred not division but unification along religious lines and people in general. In other words, he noticed the commonalities in religions and tried to take everything that was valuable. "Oh, I have never doubted the existence of God, that He created the world and governs it by His providence, that God loves most of all to do good to man, that our souls are immortal and that all crimes will be eventually punished, and virtue and altruism will be rewarded here or in the life to come." So he once wrote in his diary. But this did not prevent him from being interested in science and making many important discoveries. No, in his opinion, it did not contradict religion at all, but complemented it, since humans were created by God to create and discover new things. Franklin was a very inquisitive person by nature, and one of his discoveries was due to his attentiveness. As a postmaster of all Britain's colonies in British America, he once noticed that his subordinates complained that passenger boats coming from English ports arrived in New York much later than they went in the opposite direction. The difference could reach 2 weeks, and it simply could not be coincidence. It was caused by the current of the Gulf Stream, which seriously delayed sailing ships. Then Benjamin Franklin insisted that sailors begin to put their observations on maps once they completed this or that route. And as a result, the boundaries of the flow, its depth and speed were determined, and at the same time he gave it its current name. But this was not his only discovery and invention. As a practical man, he sought to do things that benefit people in practice. One of the first inventions was a cost-effective yet efficient stove for heating homes, which grateful fellow citizens called the Franklin stove. A quarter of a century later, he seriously improved it and, to the surprise of many citizens, didn't take a patent for this, making the design in fact the public domain. By that time, he had more than enough money and saw no point in chasing it, so he only shrugged his shoulders at the perplexed questions of common people. Yes, the public good was not an empty phrase for Franklin, but an even greater boon for the inhabitants of North America and then the rest of the world was the Franklin's lightning rod. Electricity, this mysterious force created by nature, attracted scientists in the 18th century, and they began to try to unravel its mysteries. And little by little, they did it, despite the prejudices of ordinary people. Franklin smiled, remembering the reaction of one of his neighbors to his installation of a lightning rod in his home. "It's ungodly, heresy. Celestial electricity is God's power. And if lightning strikes someone's house, it is a punishment for their sins. There's no other way, believe it or not." Honestly speaking, your ignorance is sometimes astonishing. God has many other ways of punishing a sinner, isn't it? And speaking of that matter, celestial electricity is simply a force of nature that can be spontaneous, Mr. Believe It or Not. Do not react to provocative people. Fortunately, he did not swear to enter into a discussion at all, since he had long preached such virtues as moderation and the ability to avoid extremes, and he tolerated unjust accusations as much as possible. Pride was one of his ultimate sins. And Franklin trained himself in every possible way, such a quality as calmness, so as not to get upset over all sorts of things of no importance and not to worry about all sorts of uncontrolled by him accidents. There are 3 things that are extraordinarily difficult to do: break steel, crush a diamond, and get to know yourself. He remembered his own words. And it's even more difficult to change yourself, because bad habits very often become man's second nature. But Franklin worked hard at it, planning his day and highlighting what was most important to him. It can be said that he came up with his own time management system, and it turned out to be decently workable. Finally, Franklin wasted no time on idle fantasies and was convinced that one today is worth more than 2 tomorrows, and only if you work hard, you can count on the result, and he who lives in hope risks starving to death. Or at the very least, not to do what you desire within your heart. One of the greatest figures of the 18th century rubbed his temples wearily. Age was already taking its toll and urgently needed rest. And he's still the Postmaster General of the United States. And tomorrow his duties won't go away. Perhaps it will be necessary to think about a successor. It is no good if he doesn't cope and fails the state he founded. Benjamin Franklin lived for almost 4 more years and died in early April of 1790. His funeral was attended by virtually the entire adult population of Philadelphia. Enjoyed the episode? Subscribe and leave a like, and watch other episodes on Wealth History Channel.